Alright, in this lab video we are going to create a simple login control, but we're going to do this using the MVC architecture. So this should give you some insight into MVC. Just some background information about MVC. It is essentially a modular architecture that separates the view from the model and has a coordinating element called a controller. So our simple login control will work something like this. So for instance, it will expect a certain username password combination. If it fails, or if we fail to provide that, it reports on it, as you see here. Provided that the username password combination is correct, we'll be redirected to an application main, which is very simple at the moment. Now this simple login control does not interface with any backend database, so the password and the username, they're both hard-coded into the PHP code. But again, that's not the point of this video. It's mainly to illustrate MVC at work. So in addition to MVC, we'll also mess around with some sessions just to keep that that login active. So for instance, let me just show you again. If I log in here, if I refresh the page, it'll stay in the application main because my session is still active. If I go back to the index, it should redirect me to my application main because my session is still active. If for instance I tried to access the application main without a session, it'll send me right back to the login page. So this is basically the control that we're going to build. Now to illustrate what's going to happen here, we go back to MVC itself, that illustration, that typical illustration of MVC model view controller, but we contextualize it with our login control elements. So the views of our login control will be our login page, which will have our the fields to accept the username and the password and the buttons, and that little error message prompt there. We also have another view called our application main, which is the other page that you saw after the user logged in successfully. That's a very basic page, but it will access user information. If you noticed, let me just show you here again. If you notice, as I logged in, it knew my name. So it says to me, you are now logged in admin. And this is not hard-coded. This is actually pulled up from the model that we built here. Over here, our model is called a user model, and that user model represents the data of an active user of the system. So we actually pulled the user's username from that model within the application main's view. So we can actually see the view accessing the model directly in that regard. In addition to that, our user controller has functions built into it to allow logging in, logging out, for instance, and we'll throw some additional things such as create account and so on in there. We won't actually implement it right now, but this should get us started in terms of understanding MVC at the code level. Now, in addition to these classes, these two are classes, the user control and the user model are classes. The application main and the login page, they're just some PHP scripts that mostly have UI elements in them. As the name suggests, they're views. There's also an index page which sort of takes in all of the requests that may come into our MVC architected login control. Now the reason why we need this guy is because we need to somehow initialize all of our controllers and find the best controller for the particular request that may be coming in. Alright, so this for now we'll just have one controller, but keep in mind that you can have a number of controllers that correspond with a number of models within your designs. So as the system actually grows in terms of its functionality, you might see let's say, account controller or some sort of content controller or something to that effect to take care of all of the manipulations on the respective models pertaining to that particular service. Alright, and in addition to that, you'll see a lot of other corresponding views pop up. So MVC, in short, is this modular architecture that separates the view from the business elements and uses a coordinating element called a controller in the mix. And oftentimes you'll have an index which serves as the entry point to the MVC architecture application. So let's get started. Let's look at the code here. So what I'll advise you to do is go to your deployment directory, create a subdirectory. You can call it anything you wish. I called mine MVC, and I'd like for you to create these files as you see here: index.php, login.php, main.php, user_controller.inc.php, user_model.inc.php. Alright, so these are all of the files that we'll be working with to create our login control. So what we'll do first is that we'll start at the model, the level of the model. Since it's relatively basic, there's not much code to go in there. So I'll head over to user model, and I've already started the skeleton of the class itself in PHP. So we start a PHP delimiters, we say class user model, and we open brackets, close the delimiters. The first thing that we throw in there is a private attribute called username, which will store the actual username of an active user. In addition to that, we want to throw in our constructor, and what a constructor would do is it will just take in a username passed to it and then initialize its own internal username attribute with that value. Then we add a getter to grab the value of our attribute username, and then we add a setter to set the value of our attribute username. So it's a very, very basic model so far, but we can add other methods to do data access. So essentially how it works is that the model sort of represents the application level, let's say, stub of your backend data, and it has convenient accessor methods, for instance, to grab information about a record or a collection of records, depending on how you architect your model, so that they can be accessed in your views and wherever else they need to be accessed and manipulated. Alright, so once you have this code in place, you can pause here just to transcribe the code, but I'll continue. Once you have this code in place, under user_model.inc.php, alright, we'll head over to our user controller and author that one. So again, we're starting another class, user controller, using the typical syntax. One of the first things that we throw in there is a constructor. For now, we leave a lot of things empty because again, it's a very basic example just to illustrate MVC. So it's right now our constructor is empty, and then we create a first function called create, and we'll expect that this will actually be one of the functions that manipulate our model. In this case, it's actually going to create a record, or create a model, a user model, so to speak. But in essence, it's going to just insert user information into the database on our behalf. Alright, but we'll leave this empty for now because we're not doing any database level access. Right now we're just interested in authenticating. And so we're going to start our login, and this is one of the main functions that we're going to work with, since authentication is essentially logging in and logging out, but mostly just logging in the sense of identifying the user and then giving them access to the system. Alright, so our login function takes two arguments, username and password. Alright, we're going to throw some sessions in there, and this is where we're gonna actually work with our user model that we just created. So we create let's say a simple if statement like that references an authenticate method that we're going to author very soon, and this authenticate function will take a username and a password, and then it will verify it possibly against the backend database. But for now, we're going to hard code the username and the password in there, and it returns true if it's authentic or false if it's not. So our if statement determines whether it's authentic or not, whether the identity is authentic or not, and in the event that it is authentic, then we start a session for the user now. As discussed in class, the session start is what's typically called whenever you need to deal with PHP sessions, and that sort of gets everything initialized as it should be. And once we do that, we then instantiate our user model object with the username that is authentic. Alright, so this is where we actually create the object, create our model, and it's stored under the reference user. And the next thing we do is we set the user object to the session. So we're actually taking that entire object, that PHP object, and saving it as a session value to be used elsewhere, possibly in another view, for instance. But the user object will stay active in the active session, and that's what's typically done when dealing with login, authentication mechanisms in applications. And it's always useful to have the user information on hand, such as the username, and you can even throw additional things in there, such as the role of the user, that will give an indication of the privileges of the user. So you can always keep checking to see whether that active user of that active session is able to access certain features of the system or not. So you don't necessarily have to keep fetching that information from the backend database. You would just initialize your user model on authentication and set it into this active session and have it available to the application as you go along. Alright, so we assume at this point that the user is definitely authentic. So after we've set up a session for the user and we've assigned that user object that we've created, the user model rather that we've created, to the session variable, then we return true. So our login will essentially return true after it's authenticated the user and created a session for that user based on the user model. Otherwise, if the user is not authentic or not authorized in that sense, you will just return false. So login will return false if we fail to authenticate the user. Alright, so let's take a look at that authenticate function. So it's going to be, for now, it's going to take a username and a password, and it's going to do something very basic. I would advise keeping this code, this hard-coded code in there. Again, the idea is to eventually replace that code with some sort of data level access where we actually make a query to the backend database and find out whether this username and this password combination exists in the database. And if it does, then we say authentic is true, and if not, we say authentic is false. Okay. And then finally we have our logout function, and our logout function would just take that session and destroy it. Okay, just rendering it inactive, invalid. So this is our user controller. As you can see here, the controller really is designed to manipulate the model. It's designed to provide functions and operations that deal specifically with the nature of the model or the purpose of the model. So our model is the user model, and the accompanying functions that are built into the user controller that corresponds with the user model would be create, where we create a user, login, where we log that user in, authenticate, where we actually authenticate the user, and log out. Alright, so as I mentioned, you can create a number of controllers that have specialized functions that pertain to their own respective models as well. Alright, but for now we're just sticking to one controller, one model for simplicity's sake. Alright, so that's our user controller. Right now, what we're going to do is we're going to head over to our login page. Alright, and it's our view. So we're going to look at our view. We're going to start our view, and our view is supposed to look something like this. Okay, so it's simple HTML so far. What we're going to throw into our view is the form. So we're going to start our form. We're going to say, form method is post. We're actually going to set the action to index. Now, like I mentioned, our index is the entry point to our application. All right. So our index is going to interpret where this thing is going to go and find the appropriate controller for the task. And you'll see how that's done in a minute. So we're going to build our form and add our username field and our password field. And this is where we throw in our submit button. But pay close attention to name equals up and value equals login, because we're going to use this information to let's say delegate to a particular controller within the index itself. Alright, the way this is going to come across on the server side is that it's going to have op equals login, and we can keep doing this throughout the application using that same OP name, but with different values to denote different let's say operations or different tasks to be performed by various other controllers in the mix. So right now it's just basic HTML with the form, and we're going to leave it as is. So let's head over to our index. Alright, again, you can pause the video here just to transcribe this code as it is. Okay, so it's regular HTML, nothing to be overwhelmed about. Alright, so let's head over to our index and see what's going on here. So far we've created our model, which is very basic. It just has a username and getters and setters. Then we've created our controller with functions to manipulate our model, such as, well, this is empty for now, such as login, which would actually authenticate the user based on the passed-in username and password. Alright, for now our username will be admin and our password will be admin, but later on we can replace this with database level access to do authentication. And what's really happening here under login is a creation of a session that stores the active user model with values in it, with a value in it rather, and we have a logout function here. So we can see that we have the model with information and the various functions to manipulate that information, manipulate the model, and make it available. So in our index, we want to sort of coordinate the two and bring them together. So the way this is supposed to work is that the login is supposed to send information to the index. The index is supposed to interpret that information and find the best controller for that task, and then forward the information to the controller, and then have the controller do whatever else it needs to do with that information. So we'll start with that. So one of the first things that we'll need to do in the index is to just initialize our controllers and our models if necessary. And the first step to do that is to just include them. We're using require once because our controller, we don't need multiple copies or multiple source copies of the user controller itself. We just need one. Similarly, we only need one reference to the user model as well. So you'll find that by doing this in the index, the user controller is able to see the user model now. Alright. Likewise, the user model is able to see the user controller if necessary, because they're all included on the same script that sort of activates them. Then next we're going to look for that OP keyword, rather that OP value. Remember I mentioned to you that on our login page we gave the name OP to our submit button, and the value here will be login. OP is just short for operation, so OP is going to be our standard for getting the index to understand what type of operation we wish to run. So the index would interpret that operation to find the best controller for that operation. So you'll see what happens here. So since we just have one controller so far, we're going to set that controller up in this line. So we're actually instantiating our user controller, making it available to index. But you can imagine if we have multiple other controllers, we can just keep instantiating the rest of them. And once we do that, we enter a switch statement, and this switch statement is what's used to interpret the operation that comes in through the entry point, which is the index of our application, and determine which is the best controller for the particular operation. So since we just have a few operations, log in, log out, and so on, that pertain to the same controller, we are going to create case switch statements to handle each of those individually. So first we're going to handle login. Okay, now we know that the login operation should be directed to our user controller's login function, and this is what we're going to do here. Alright, so we first say that we expect a username and a password if we're processing the login operation. So this login operation is coming directly from our form here, and we're expecting user and pass. Okay, so we set up variables to collect that information from the post global variable. Alright, and we save them in username and password respectively. Then we start to interact with our controller now. So once we've grabbed the information, we ask the controller to log the person in, and this statement here will call the login function on the user controller class that we've created, that we've instantiated, I should say the user controller object that we've instantiated up here, and the code within login here will run through, and it will try to authenticate. If it's authentic, then it returns true, and in addition to that, we have an active session with an active user model inside of it. If it's not authentic, then it'll return false. So what the index here would do is it will check true or false from this function call itself, and if it is true, then we send the end user to our main or application main. So we just redirect them to our application main. So here we just send them to a view, a specific view, and then we'll handle that information. We'll handle that interface separately. Okay, so if it's not valid, then we want to send them right back to the login page. But in addition to sending them back to the login page, we want to print that message that we saw earlier. Just to remind you, the message looks something like this: login incorrect, please try again. And if you notice here, the URL changed. It went from just login.php to $ERR equal 1. Alright, and you'll see how useful that is in terms of determining whether to show the message or not. So this is what's happening here. So if we can't authenticate the user, then it redirects them to login.php with that query string ERR equals 1. Alright, so to make this work, let's just go over to our login page. So the idea is that once this script, this login page here, determines that we have the query string ERR equals 1, then we want to show an error message, right? So we have to do a few other things before that. You have to make sure that the user, let's say the user doesn't, once they've logged in successfully, users should not access the login page again, which really wouldn't make sense. We don't want to logging in multiple times. So what we're going to do is we're going to stick this PHP code up at the top of login.php. And what this PHP code does is that it checks the session to see if there is an active, valid user model inside of that session object, inside of that session array. If it is, then then we want to redirect them to the application main where there should be. All right, just in case the user types in login.php and wants to go back to that login page. All right, so the way that works is, let me show you here, as I showed you before. Once they're successfully logged in, if I hit back, it really just doesn't make a difference. It'll redirect me because it detects that I have a valid user session with a valid user model inside of that session. So I never ever see, sorry, I hit back too many times. I never ever see the login page again. Even if I type in login.php up there, I never see that login page again, and that's what we want. All right, and this code makes that happen. All right, so take a look at it, and you'll understand what's going on there. So just test to see whether we have an active session. If so, we redirect the user to the application main. All right, in addition to that, we want to also show an error message in a specific place, just in the event that the login was unsuccessful. And this simple PHP code snippet does that. And what it does, it tests to see whether the query string contains the ERR name and the corresponding value of 1. If so, it will print this entire piece of HTML here that has some text in red that says login incorrect, please try again. Alright, so once we have that in place, our login form, or login.php view I should say, is more or less finished. Alright, so again, pause the video and just copy this block of code as well as that block of code in the respective regions that you see them. Alright, so let's head back to our index. So we've essentially completed our login case. Another case that we need to take care of would be our logout case. Okay, and that's very, very simple. Much of the functionality already is already inside of our user controller, so all we need to do is just detect the operation, such as logout for instance, and we call the respective function within the right controller for the job, for that particular operation. And there's a lot of redirecting that's happening here. So after the user has logged out, we want to send them back to that login page, and that's what's happening there. Alright, and we implement the default behavior just in case the user messes around with the OP switch and sends OP equals something that we can't necessarily identify, and we want to default them back to the login page here. Alright, so that's basically what's happening here. And believe it or not, our index or our entry point is finished. Alright, so again, pause the video, transcribe this code, and then we can continue. So we finished our model, we finished our controller with the functions that would manipulate our model. We finished our login page, alright, that would send the username and the password through to our index, and we finished our index that actually creates our controller, references or includes our model source, and caters to the various operations that may come into it. Alright, like I mentioned before, this index is vital typically in the MVC architecture because it represents the entry point to the application, and there are usually multiple controllers within an MVC built application, and there needs to be some person or some entity rather that determines the best controller for the job, and usually the index would be the entity to do so. And we're doing it in a very basic manner by using an OP switch, which represents operation. So OP can either be log in at times or log out at times. Okay. All right. So finally, we have to take care of the main, our application main. So this is our final view, and what the application main should look like is something like this. So it's simple text, but it tells us who's logged in. So this is the actual name that's pulled from the model within the active session that was previously created, and it gives us an option to log out. Alright, so let's start our application main. Some simple HTML would start things off. Like I mentioned before, we want to make sure that the user, if not successfully logged in, does not access the application main for obvious purposes. So if I hit main.php and I'm not logged in, I should never ever see the application main. It should redirect me back to the login page. Alright? So to get that started, we need to, just like in the login.php, add a bit of PHP code at the top of our main.php, which is our application main. And it looks something like this. And while we're doing that, we're going to include the user model source. So the application main is going to have a reference to our user model, because that's typically how the MVC architecture typically works. Some views may have direct access to the model. So this code here starts off with assessing the session. So it calls the session start, and then it tries to find an active user object inside of session start. If it does not find it, that's what this code is doing. If not, is set session underscore session user. If it does not find a valid value within that user session, it will redirect to the login page. This is what's happening here. All right. Otherwise, if it does find a valid session, a valid user object inside of that session, a user model object inside of that session, then it equates it to a variable that we can reference later on. And you'll see why we'll need a reference to that user model object. So we look at the statement here below. You are now logged in, and then there's a blank. This is the main. And then we have our logout link here. So what we want to do is throw a personalized message saying you are now logged in, and then we print the user's username. And throwing something like this in the mix would get that done. So we throw print inside of PHP delimiters, but what I'd like to bring to your attention is this. User here corresponds with this user reference up here, okay? And that user reference represents the user model that we previously created, but its instantiated version, right? And the instantiated version will actually contain a username specific to the active user. So since our active user is admin, when we test this out, it will print you are now logged in admin. This is the main, okay? And this will be dynamic, so as we create more users with different usernames, their names will be printed in place of this particular statement. Alright, the final bit I'd like to show you is this. So we use a bit of URL rewriting here. And we wanna create a logout option. So it's basically a link that would trigger the logout operation inside of user controller, all right, through the entry point called index.php here. So what we want to do is simulate a query string that looks like op equals logout to try to trigger this and get them to redirect to the login page. Okay, and that's what this is doing. So we're actually telling index that the operation is logout, and we're setting that as our hyperlink reference, and we're giving it the label of logout. All right, so you can imagine that when the user logs in, for instance, and they click on log out, it will send a message to index. Index will interpret it, understand that it's the logout operation. It will tell the user controller to actually invalidate the session by calling the logout function, and then it will redirect them away from the main.php to login.php. Alright, so that's our application main. Again, you can pause the video to transcribe the code. And this is as simple as we can possibly get for MVC in a practical, meaningful way. I mean, what we've just built is a useful authentication mechanism for any web application. And what you'll find is that it's very organized in that we can understand exactly what goes where. and we can build on top of it. So for instance, if we'd like some additional functions or some additional let's say behaviors of our user controller user model combination, we can build the manipulating functions inside of user controller here. For instance, one of the things that we can do is account creation, so we can build in on top of this create function that we've just created here to actually insert new records into the database. Alright, and let's say for instance our user model or at least the account information is described by something a bit more than just a username. Then we can head to our user model and add additional other attributes to describe the user, such as first name, last name, gender, and so on. And when, for instance, we'd like to create a session for a user, we can pull up that information and store it inside of the user model, and then take that user model and store that inside of the session, so we'll have access to all of the information that we wish on the active user inside of an active session. And that, as we know it, as we've seen it work here, is accessible by various views, so we can actually print out that information at will in this manner. Alright? Okay, so that's about it. Next time we'll look at a more advanced version of this that deals with the an actual sign-up procedure, form validation, and database interaction.